Isabel Allende, House of the Spirits, Part 9. Siren will lose his job and undergo great suffering, but he will be rescued by a woman with whom he will open a business, and that the twins are a husband and wife forced to share a single destiny, perpetually wounding one another with the blows of their swords. Dreams were not the only thing that Clara read. She could also predict the future and recognize people's intentions, abilities that she maintained throughout her life and that increased with time. She announced the death of her godfather, Don Solomon Valdez, a broker at the stock exchange, who, convinced that he had lost everything he owned, hanged himself from the chandelier in his elegant office. There they found him, at Clara's insistence, looking every bit like a dejected sheep, exactly as she had described him on her slate. She predicted her father's hernia, all the earthquakes and other natural disturbances. The one and only time snow fell in the capital, freezing to death the poor people in their shanty towns, and the rose bushes in the gardens of the rich, and the identity of the murderer of a schoolgirl long before the police discovered the second corpse. But no one believed her, and Severo did not want her giving her opinion on matters concerning criminals who were not related to the family. With a single great glance, Clara realized that Giulio Armando was going to swindle her father in the business of Australian sheep, because she read it in the color of his aura. She wrote it to her father, but he did not pay attention, and by the time he remembered her prediction, he had already lost half his fortune, and his partner was off in the Caribbean, newly wealthy, with a harem of big-bottomed mulattas and his own private boat for sunbathing. Clara's ability to move objects without touching them did not disappear with the onset of menstruation, as Nana had predicted, but rather became more pronounced until she was so accomplished that she could move the keys on the piano with the cover down, even though she never learned to move the instrument itself around the drawing room as she'd wanted to. She spent the main part of her time and energy in these extravagant pursuits. She developed the capacity to guess an astonishing percentage of the cards in a deck, and invented games of fantasy to play with her brothers and sisters. Her father forbade her to read the fortune in cards and to evoke ghosts and mischievous spirits that annoyed the rest of the family and terrorized the servants. But Nevaeh understood that the more limitations and shocks her daughter was subjected to, the madder she became, and decided to leave her in peace with her spiritualistic tricks, her fortune-telling games, and her cavernous silence, and did her best to love her unconditionally and accept her as she was. Clara grew like a wild plant, despite the recommendations of Dr. Cuevas, who had brought from Europe the novel idea of cold baths and electric shocks for the treatment of the insane. Barabbas accompanied the child day and night, except during the normal periods of his sexual activity. He was always hovering around her like a giant shadow, as silent as the little girl herself. He threw himself at her feet when she sat down and slept beside her every night, chugging like a locomotive. He became so attached to his mistress that when she sleepwalked through the house, the dog followed, imitating her posture. Whenever there was a full moon, they could be seen gliding down the corridors like two ghosts floating through the pale light. As the dog grew in size, his distractedness became more evident. He never comprehended, for example, the transparent nature of glass, and in moments of great emotion he would charge the windows at a gallop, and with the innocent intention of catching a fly, he would fall through the other side in a din of breaking glass, surprised and disappointed. In those days, window panes were brought from France by ship, and the animal's mania for crashing into them became a problem, until Clara thought of painting cats on the glass. When Barabbas became an adult, he stopped fornicating with the feet of the piano, as he had in his childhood, and his reproductive instinct declared itself only when he sniffed a bitch in heat in his close environs. On such occasions, there was neither chain nor door that could hold him back. He would hurl himself onto the street, overcoming every obstacle in his path, and remain at large for 2 or 3 days. He always returned with the poor dog hanging off him, suspended in the air, impaled on his immense masculinity. The children had to be whisked out of the way so they would not see the horrendous spectacle of the gardener hosing the dogs down with freezing water, until many gallons and kicks and other indignities later, Barabbas became unstuck from his beloved, leaving her to die in the courtyard of the house, where Savara was obliged to finish her off with a coup de grace. Clara's adolescence passed calmly in her parents' large house with its 3 courtyards. She was spoiled to death by her older brothers, by Severo, who preferred her to all his other children, by Nevia, and by Nana, who alternated her sinister attacks disguised as a ghost with the most tender of attentions. Almost all her brothers and sisters had married or left, some to travel, others to work in the provinces, and the big house, which had contained such a large family, was almost empty, with many of its rooms locked. The child spent whatever free time her tutors left her in reading, moving numerous different objects without touching them, chasing Barabbas, practicing various techniques of prognostication, and learning to knit, which was the only one of the domestic arts she ever mastered. Ever since the Holy Thursday on which Father Restrepo had accused her of being possessed, there had been a shadow over her head that the love of her parents and her siblings' discretion kept under control. Still, word of her unlikely talents circulated by whispers in gatherings of local ladies. Nevia realized that people never invited her daughter to their home, and that even her own cousins did everything they could to avoid her. She so successfully compensated for the lack of friends with her own total dedication, however, that Clara grew up happy and in later years would recall her childhood as a luminous part of her existence, despite her solitude and muteness. All her life she would remember the afternoons spent in the company of her mother in the sewing room, where Nevia sewed clothing for the poor on her machine and told stories and anecdotes about the family. She would point to the daguerreotypes on the wall and tell Clara of the past. "You see that serious man with a beard? That's your Uncle Mateo, who went to Brazil on some scheme that had to do with emeralds, but a fiery mulatta gave him the evil eye. All his hair fell out, his nails dropped off, he lost his teeth, and he had to go see a sorcerer, a voodoo priest, a dark negro, who gave him an amulet, and then his teeth grew back, his nails came out again, and he got it back his hair. Look at him, Clara. He's hairier than an Indian. He was the only bald man in the world who ever got a second head of hair." Clara would smile without saying a word, and Nevia would go on talking because she had grown used to her daughter's silence. In addition, she nourished the hope that if she kept putting ideas into Clara's head, sooner or later she would ask a question and regain her speech. "And this," she would say, "is your Uncle Juan. I loved him very much. He once farted and that became his death sentence. A great disgrace. It was during a picnic lunch. All my cousins and I were out together on the most fragrant spring afternoon with our muslin dresses and our hats full of flowers and ribbons, and the boys were wearing their Sunday best. Juan took off his white jacket. Why, I can see him now. He rolled up his sleeves and swung gracefully from the branch of a tree, hoping that with his trapeze artist's skill he could win the admiration of Constanza Andrade, the Harvest Queen, with whom from the moment he laid eyes on her he had been desperately in love. Juan did 2 impeccable push-ups and 1 complete somersault, but on his next flip over he let go a loud burst of wind. Don't laugh, Clara, it was terrible." There was an embarrassed silence, and the Harvest Queen began to laugh uncontrollably. Juan put on his jacket and grew very pale. He walked slowly away from the group, and we never saw him again. They even looked for him in the Foreign Legion. They asked for him in all their consulates, but he was never heard of again. I think he must have been a missionary and gone to minister to the lepers of the out on Easter Island, which is as far away as a man can go to forget and be forgotten, because it's not on the normal routes of navigation and isn't even shown on Dutch maps. From that day on, he was referred to as Juan of the Fart. Nevia would take her daughter to the window and show her the dried-out trunk of the poplar tree. It was an enormous tree, she would say. I had it cut before my eldest son was born. They say it was so tall that you could see the whole city from its top, but the only one who got that high had no eyes to see with it. It was a tradition in the Del Valle family that when any of the young men wanted to wear long pants, he had to climb to prove his valor. It was like an initiation rite. The tree was full of marks. I saw them with my own eyes when they knocked it down. From the first middle-sized branches, which were thick as chimneys, you could already see the marks left by the grandfathers who had made the same ascent in their own youth. From the initial cut in the tree into the trunk, you could tell who had climbed higher, who was the bravest, as well as who had stopped, too terrified to continue. One day it was the turn of Geronimo, the blind cousin. He began to climb, feeling his way up the branches without a moment's hesitation, for he couldn't see how high up he was, and he had no intuition of the void. He reached the top, but he wasn't able to complete the J of his initial because he became unstuck like a gargoyle and plummeted headfirst to the ground, landing at the feet of his father and brothers. He was 15 years old. They wrapped the body in a sheet and took it to his mother, who spat in all their faces and shouted at them with a sailor's insults and cursed the men who had induced her son to climb the tree, until finally the Sisters of Charity came to cart her off in a straitjacket. I knew that one day my sons would be expected to continue that barbarous tradition. That's why I had them cut it down. I didn't want Luis and the other children growing up in the shadow of that scaffold in the courtyard. At times, Clara would accompany her mother and 2 or 3 of her suffragette friends on their visits to factories, where they would stand on soapboxes and make speeches to the women who worked there, while the foremen and bosses, snickering and hostile, observed them from a prudent distance. Despite her tender age and complete ignorance of matters of this world, Clara grasped the absurdity of the situation and wrote in her notebook about the contrast of her mother and her friends, in their fur coats and suede boots, speaking of oppression, equality, and rights to a sad, resigned group of hard-working women in denim aprons, their hands red with chilblains. From the factory, the ladies would move on to the tea room on the Plaza de Armas, where they would stop for tea and pastry and discuss the progress of their campaign, not for a moment letting this frivolous distraction divert them from their flaming ideals. At other times, her mother would take her to the slums on the outskirts of the city or to the tenements, where they arrived with their car piled high with food and with clothes that Nivea and her friends sewed for the poor. On these occasions, too, the child wrote with formidable intuition that charity had no effect on such monumental injustice. Her relationship to her mother was close and cheerful, and Nivea, despite having given birth to 15 children, treated Clara as if she were her only child, creating a tie so strong that it continued into succeeding generations as a family tradition. Nana had become an ageless woman, still in full possession of all her strength of her younger years. She was still able to leap out of corners, hoping to scare the child's muteness away, just as she could spend the entire day standing over the hellfire in the center of the third courtyard, pushing an enormous stick around in the copper pot where she bubbled the thick topaz-colored quince jam that once cooled Nivea delivered in molds of all shapes and sizes to the poor. Accustomed to living surrounded by children, Nana turned all her tenderness to Clara after the others left home. Even though the child was by now too old for it, she bathed her as if she were a baby, dousing her in the enameled tub with water scented with jasmine and basil, rubbing her with a sponge, soaping her meticulously without missing the least chink of ear or foot, massaging her with cologne and powdering her with a swan's down puff, and brushing her hair with infinite patience until it was as soft and shiny as an underwater plant. She dressed her, put her to bed, brought her breakfast on a tray, and forced her to drink linden tea for her nerves, chamomile for her stomach, lemon for translucent skin, rue for bile, and mint for her breath, until the child became a beautiful angelic being who walked through the halls and patios wrapped in a scent of flowers, a rustling of starched petticoats, and a halo of curls and ribbons. Clara's childhood came to an end as she entered her youth within the walls of her house, in a world of terrifying stories and calm silences. It was a world in which time was not marked by calendars or watches, and objects had a life of their own, in which apparitions sat at the table and conversed with human beings. The past and the future formed part of a single unit, and the reality of the present was a kaleidoscope of jumbled mirrors where everything and anything could happen. It is a delight for me to read her notebook from those years, which describe a magic world that no longer exists. Clara lived in a universe of her own invention, protected from life's inclement weather, where the prosaic truth of material objects mingled with the tumultuous reality of dreams, and the laws of physics and logic did not always apply. Clara spent this time wrapped in her fantasies, accompanied by the spirits of the air, the water, and the earth. For 9 years she was so happy that she felt no need to speak. Everyone had lost all hope of hearing her voice again, when on her birthday, after blowing out 19 candles on her chocolate cake, she tried out the voice that she had kept in storage for all those years, and that sounded like an untuned instrument. "I'm going to be married soon," she said. "To whom?" Severo asked. "To Rosa's fiancé," Clara replied. Only then did they realize she had spoken for the first time in all those years. The miracle shook the house to its foundations and set the whole family weeping. They called each other on the telephone, word went out across the city, and they summoned Dr. Cuevas. Who could not believe the news. In the uproar about Clara's regaining her voice, they all forgot what she said when Esteban Trueba, whom they had not seen since Rosa's funeral, showed up at the door to ask for Clara's hand. Esteban Trueba alighted in the station and carried his 2 suitcases himself. The iron cupola the British had built in imitation of Victoria's station in the days when they had the concession to the national railways and not changed at all since the last time he had been there several years before. The same dirty windows, the same shoeshine boys, the same women selling biscuits and candies, the same porters and men with their dark caps bearing the insignia of the British town, with no one had thought to replace with the colors of the national flag. He hailed a carriage and gave his mother's address. The city looked unfamiliar. There was a jumble of modernity, a myriad of women showing their bare calves, and men in vests and pleated pants, an uproar of workers drilling holes in the pavement, knocking down trees to make room for telephone poles, knocking down telephone poles to make room for buildings, knocking down buildings to plant trees, a blockade of itinerant vendors hawking the wonders of this grindstone, that toasted peanut, this little doll that dances by itself without a single wire or thread. Look for yourself, run your hand over it, a whirlwind of garbage dumps, food stands, factories, cars hurtling into carriages, and sweat-drawn trolleys as they called the old horses that hauled the municipal transport, a heavy breathing of crowds, a sound of running, of scurrying this way and that, of impatience and schedules. Esteban felt oppressed by it. He hated the city much more than he had remembered. He recalled the open meadows of the countryside, days clocked by the fall of rain, the vast solitude of the fields, the cool quiet of the river, and his silent house. "This city is a shithole," he concluded. The carriage trotted toward the house where he had grown up. He shuddered at how badly the neighborhood had declined over the years, ever since the rich had decided to move their houses farther up the hill from everyone else, and the city had expanded into the foothills of the Cordillera. There was not a trace of the square where he had played as a little boy. It was now an empty lot filled with carts from the markets that were parked among piles of garbage where stray dogs rummaged. His house was a ruin. He saw all the signs of the passage of time. On the rickety, old-fashioned stained glass door with its motifs of exotic birds, there was a bronze knocker in the shape of a woman's hand pressing on a ball. He knocked and waited what seemed like an interminable while until the door was opened with a tug on a string that ran from the doorknob to the top of the stairs. His mother lived on the second floor and rented out the first floor to a button factory. Esteban began to climb the creaky steps, which had not been waxed in a long time. An ancient servant whose existence he had completely forgotten stood waiting for him on the landing and embraced him tearfully, just as she had greeted him at 15 when he came home from working at the notary office where he earned his living, copying property transfers and powers of attorney. Nothing had changed, not even the placement of the furniture, but everything struck him as different. The hallways with their worn wood floors, the broken window panes patched with scraps of cardboard, the dusty ferns languishing in rusty tin cans and chipped ceramic pots, the fetid smells of urine mixed with food that turned his stomach. What poverty, Esteban thought. He wondered what on earth his sisters did with all the money he sent her so that she could live in dignity. Firula came out to meet him with a sad grimace of welcome. She was greatly changed. She was no longer the opulent woman he had left years ago. She had lost weight, and her nose seemed enormous on her angular face. She gave off an aura of melancholy and bewilderment, a scent of lavender and old clothes. They embraced in silence. How's Mama? Esteban asked. Come see, she's waiting for you, Firula replied. They walked down a corridor of connecting rooms, each identical to the next, dark and small, with tomb-like walls, high ceilings, and narrow windows. Their wallpaper of discolored flowers and languid maidens, stained from the soot of the coal stoves and the patina of time and poverty. From far away they could hear the voice of a radio announcer singing the praises of Dr. Ross's pills, tiny but effective against constipation, insomnia, and bad breath. They stopped outside the closed door of the bedroom of Doña Esther Treva. Here she is, said Firula. Esteban opened the door. It was several seconds before he could see in the darkness. The smell of medicine and decay hit him in the face, a sweet odor of sweat, dampness, confinement, and something else that at first he could not quite identify, but that quickly stuck with him like a plague. The smell of decomposing flesh. A thread of light leaked through the window, which was ajar, and he was able to make out the wide bed in which his father had died and his mother had slept every night since she was married. It was carved in black wood, with a canopy of angels in relief and a few scraps of red brocade that were frayed with age. His mother was propped up in a half-seated position.